Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Marielle Villeray, Program Development Director for the Office of Academic Initiatives and Strategic Innovation here at the Graduate Center. Thank you for joining us for the second event in the Underscored series of virtual performances, which we've paired with conversations between musicians from the Copland House Ensemble and musicians from the Graduate Center Doctoral Program in Music. We are using the Zoom webinar platform today, and I want to take a moment now to acquaint you with the Q&A tool so that you can ask questions throughout the program to be answered during the live talkback. You'll find the digital Q&A tool in the lower panel of your Zoom window. This icon is a set of overlapping conversation bubbles labeled Q&A. Once you click on that icon, a new window should appear in which you can type your questions for the artists. These questions will be monitored and delivered to the moderator for discussion in the latter half of the program. I'll now hand it off to Michael Boriskin at the Copland House studio to tell you more about the music.
Greetings, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Michael Boriskin, the Artistic and Executive Director of Copland House, and I am so delighted to welcome you to the second program in a new virtual series that Copland House and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York are presenting. This series is called Underscored, in which each program spotlights an important American musical composition, past or present, beginning with a short conversation with our artists about the piece, moving on to a complete performance of the work, and concluding with a live Q&A between you, our viewers, and our performers. Today's program features the Sonata for Violin and Piano by Aaron Copland, our namesake. Copland traveled extensively, but was based for most of his life in New York. The last 30 years of his life in this wonderful house on a hill surrounded by several acres of woods, not far from the Hudson River, just north of New York City. The Violin Sonata, however, was written on the West Coast, specifically on the back lot of one of America's most important film studios, the Samuel Goldwyn Studios. Many may not be aware that Copland was also a highly accomplished, pioneering film composer. He worked on a handful of feature films between the early 1940s and the early 1960s. In 1943, he found himself working on a high-profile picture called The North Star, and that required him to be on site in LA for virtually the entire duration of the filming, something like 7 months. Probably because there were a lot of songs and choruses and dances that were actually incorporated into the action. Many creative artists who are working on film projects will know that there's a lot of waiting around time on feature film projects. There's a lot of downtime, and Copland was as practical and productive as always. He put that downtime to good use on the back lot. And he wrote, while he was working on the North Star, 2 important scores. This Sonata for Violin and Piano, which was his only major work featuring the violin, and another piece which became one of the most emblematic American works of the 20th century, the iconic ballet Appalachian Spring, featuring Martha Graham, the modern dance pioneering choreographer. Both of these pieces really share musical DNA. They have, both of them, a sense of deep humanity. There's a kind of purity and optimism about both of the works. Copland may have viewed the Violin Sonata as a kind of palate cleanser because he had spent much of the years of America's involvement in World War II, the early 1940s, creating big American-themed works that celebrate the American spirit. Most were much bigger works like Lincoln Portrait, Rodeo, another iconic ballet, Appalachian Spring, a shorter work, Fanfare for the Common Man, which has become a kind of alternative national anthem. But it would not be correct to think of the Violin Sonata as a throwaway. It is as exquisitely detailed and as sensitively and intelligently constructed as anything that Copland wrote. It is a totally delightful, gracious, and brilliant work. After our performance, please stay around for the Q&A. There's the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can type in all of your questions and comments. We hope to try to get to as many of them as we can. But before we hear the piece, my partner in this performance, the wonderful young violinist Magdalena Filipczak from the Graduate Center doctoral program, and I will chat about the Copland Violin Sonata and compare notes. So can we talk a little bit about, your first impressions of coming to the Copland Violin Sonata? Mine happened many years ago.
Well, the sonata itself is different than the usual violin sonatas, which are quite like virtuosic. I think this one is, of course, also has lots of challenges, but it has a different atmosphere. It's more like a tale, one tale. Although it's in 3 movements, it feels like it goes very seamless to me. Even though like the first movement and second are not attacca, it's very coherent, the work. I found also that as far as it's coherent, also each movement has very different emotions in it itself, and the pureness of the intervals, like the perfect intervals that he uses a lot, in terms of the harmony, right? The openness of the chords, but also like in terms of the melody, how he creates the melody. It also has the perfect intervals a lot. So that's quite challenging for string player, to make it, very singing, but at the same time, so it's in tune, actually.
Yeah, I've often felt that there's almost nothing in Copland that's easy. When it's very brilliant and very virtuosic, that has its own problems. But when it's very spare, which it often is, that really is one of the hallmarks of Copland's writing, especially in the slower music, there's no place to hide. Every note has to be in place. So what took you by surprise about this, having played the sextet and known some of his other works through studying?
Well, I think in terms of the differences between the sextet and the sonata is that I find the sextet, in the sextet, the rhythm is super important, and it's also important in the violin sonata. However, I think there is much more cantilena in the violin sonata, and it's
more singing.
Yes, more singing, more simple tunes. Also, I think there's more folk in it than in the sextet. American native, I think, tunes I use very much so. I think when we started to work on it, I mentioned to you that once the piece started to make more and more sense to me, especially when we were playing together, I saw the images of some American TV series that I watched as a kid in Poland. They were playing lots of, such as Little House on the Prairie or Dr. Queen. So there were in those series you also had always episodes of like showing Native Americans and a little bit of that atmosphere and tunes. So it's interesting that actually this came to my mind when we started to play it.
Well, that's really fascinating. I mean, there's a lot in what you just said to unpack, because the violin sonata was written in the early 1940s at a time when Copland had already started to help define what the world has come to think of as an American sound, which was reflected in succeeding generations in the kind of music, the kind of commercial music or television or film music that that you mentioned. This is one of the main sources of Copland's historic importance in the evolution of American music. In the early 1940s, if you think of the other pieces, some of the other pieces that he wrote then, with names like Lincoln Portrait and Rodeo, Fanfare for the Common Man, Letter from Home, Appalachian Spring. I mean, he was working on the Violin Sonata at the same time that he was starting to assemble the materials for Appalachian Spring. And, you know, Appalachian Spring is kind of an emblematic work of Americana, but it so transcends that. And so much, I hear so much of that in the Violin Sonata. It's interesting when you talked about the brilliance and the singing and the folk-like quality of the music that Copland actually wrote in his memoirs about the Violin Sonata. For whatever reason, he said, I had no desire to write a piece that was either virtuosic or dissonant or had folk materials in it.
Right.
And somehow that's all there. Not really the dissonance. You're quite right about the purity and the sort of fundamental nature of the piece. But it's fascinating that the piece does have a brilliance, does have sort of a folk-like sense about it. And Copland also wrote in the memoirs that he didn't think of this piece as a work for violin with piano accompaniment, but really a piece, as you said, for violin and piano as a real chamber work. And there's certainly a real balance between the two parts. Maybe talk for a minute about that really exquisite and sort of singular middle movement, the slow movement, which we were talking before about being so spare and so few notes. It's a really striking movement, sort of few minutes in the middle of this sonata in being so still and mysterious and in so many ways. What was your sense about it when you first came to that and saw this ostensibly very, very simple music as the middle movement of this piece?
Right. So after the first movement, which is not too melancholic, right? Comes something that's, as you said, it's very mysterious and melancholic. I found it, and very much, again, very, very open writing. Not the texture is quite thin. Therefore, like two instruments, I feel, are even more like one than in the other movements. Creating even though we are playing like often after each other, right? I'll be in between each other. It's more like filling in rather than like imitating, I think. And it gives, I think, very unique atmosphere for the second movement, in terms of like sonata writing for violin, where it's like that pure, completely, as I said, pure simplicity, openness, and there is something also, the feeling of you don't know what's coming. It's unexpected, and then suddenly the third movement starts and everything is cut off. It's really incredible. I think it's also a good great planning on like having a really great impact for the beginning of the third movement.
It's totally striking because yes, I mean, it is with one octave in the piano that starts the finale, that kicks off the finale, the atmosphere changes. I mean, literally with the very first note. And it speaks to, you know, how Copland handles the entire violin sonata, and in a much larger sense, how, you know, he approached so many of his compositions. He always was talking about, he loved to use a word that he got from his revered professor, Nadia Boulanger, the legendary Nadia Boulanger in France in the early 1920s. He always talked about music and passages, sections being choisis, really carefully selected and carefully chosen. There's nothing extra certainly in the slow movement, but in anything in the Copland Violin Sonata. There are no extra notes there, even when there's a lot of things going on in both of the instruments. You know, everything is really very well chosen, and it's a very special piece. I'm delighted that we had the chance to perform it. We're going to hear it now. We played it together at Elabash Hall at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. We hope you enjoy the performance and stick with us because we will go right after the performance into a live Q&A, and we can't wait to see some of your questions. So enjoy the performance. Thanks for joining us now. thank you so much for joining us all as we journey across the American musical landscape, underscoring American music. A couple of things before we dive right in, because I see we already have a couple of questions in the queue. This program is being recorded, so do be aware of that. And again, a reminder, there's a handy Q&A button at the bottom center of your screen. Ask your questions, type your questions in. We will try to get as many of them as we can in the limited time we have. So we've got a really interesting question here. Hold on, I am just getting myself organized. Got a really interesting question here. Does Aaron Copland's music still excite and interest young up-and-coming performers and students? Is he considered relevant? Wow. Magda, maybe you wanna have a crack at that one?
Great.
You're younger than I am, so go for it.
I think so. It does, because I can see the rest of the sentence in terms of like his nationalistic approach to composing. I think that nationalistic is not always a bad thing in compositions, because as we know, some composers were using that in their composing. Also, I'm from Poland. Lots of Polish composers, Szymanowski, would use Polish folk. So it's something that actually excites, I think, if there are some nationalistic elements, people especially from different cultures, like me, for example. And as I said, it's very contrasting music than any other violin sonatas. So I think it does excite, especially like in terms of the violin part. There is a really an opportunity for cantilena, a lot of, as I said before, for singing. It's kind of operatic very often, like an aria. Even like the very ending, as we just heard, there was a lot of kind of recitativo like moment at the very end. Even the very opening of sonata, it's also a little bit like that. So yes, to answer shortly.
Yeah, I mean, that question really makes an interesting point about the whole notion of nationalism. We could spend a whole hour talking about it. But just to say that it was, I think, kind of critical at that point in American musical history and American cultural history, which we're talking about the early 20th century, almost the first half of the 20th century, for American concert music and ballet, opera, and so forth to develop a more, what Copland called, a more recognizably American idiom, where none really existed. It's very easy to forget that America is a young country. Most of its composers throughout the 19th century, during the 19th century, went to Europe to finish their studies, and they worked usually in the German-speaking capitals of Europe, and they came back seeking to emulate the sound and the aesthetic of their great German masters. And so American music didn't often sound American. And this is something that Copland was very interested in. It's amazing to think of him as even a young man in his 20s, thinking when he was studying in Europe and when he was studying in France after the First World War, I'm surrounded by all this music. Russian music sounds Russian, German music sounds German, French sounds French, Spanish sounds Spanish. Why doesn't American music have that kind of profile? And that was something that he consciously set out to do already in the 1920s. And I think that once he and others of his contemporaries like Virgil Thomson and Roy Harris, once they really were able to sort of develop that cultural identity for the country, then it was done and it was possible to get past that. So it's a really good point that was, that was made in the question. The nationalism, the cultural identity was established, and then that could be integrated in a much more deep way. And again, the question sort of suggests that there's so much more in the music, but behind a kind of, simple, glib, empty nationalism. So I think that's one of the reasons that Copland's music certainly stays with us for as long as it has, and is still, most important, played, almost more than so many of the other works by American composers of that era throughout the early and mid 20th century. Other question.
Michael, can I
Yes.
choose? Because I think it would be nice. Kevin Lindegaard said, neither of you mentioned jazz. In the opening piece, for me, the piano part sounds very much like piano pieces I have heard by Chick Corea.
Yes.
For example. So it's actually, it's also something that, like, in America, jazz at that time, right, was very important. And I do agree that there is, we didn't mention that, but we do agree that that there is a lot of it, even like in the third movement, in terms of the groove of the third movement at the beginning. Also, I think there is a lot of like rhythms, jazz rhythms, playing, like also like inner measure. There's a meter, but then there are like inner meters often also in between the major one. So it's a very interesting question. I like that.
Oh, it sure is. By the way, Kevin, who asked that question, is in UK, and I see we have a couple of other, at least a couple of other attendees in the UK, which is wonderful. There's a question from Tim, who reminded us that we spoke a bit at the beginning in the intro about Copland's involvement in film music and what were Copland's feelings about it, and was it a problem as far as his being a serious composer. Copland was sort of singularly adventurous and, let's say, receptive to all kinds of stimuli around him, and also was very eager to compose for what was considered new technologies then, which is really interesting. He was one of the first concert composers to write for radio. Certainly he was among the first important American composers to work in Hollywood, in feature films. He did a number of things for television later on in the 1950s. There was less of a sort of divide between concert composers and film composers in Europe as there was for a very, very long time in America. I think that really doesn't exist anymore. But as always with Copland, he tailored his music for the task at hand. And he actually wrote a number of really perceptive and insightful articles about working in feature films. He understood that the music in a film had a certain function and a certain purpose, unlike music that is by itself on a stage. He had a wonderful line in an essay that he wrote about film music in the early 1940s that speaking about the screen by itself being a cold place, and that the music was, he thought, like a small flame under the screen to warm it up, which is, I think, a wonderful image. You know, there are certain similarities, certain shared DNA amongst all of Copland's music, regardless of the style of the music or the genre that he was writing in. There is a kind of transparency of texture and sound. There's an economy of notes. There's no extra notes, no matter how complicated the music gets. And there's also a kind of reserve to his music, kind of reserved expressivity, regardless of how theatrical or swashbuckling the music might be. God, we have a whole list of questions, other questions and comments here. Joel references the Copland biography, a wonderful biography that Howard Pollack, a professor and scholar in Texas, wrote. The question is that Pollack says that this is very much a wartime piece, in that it suggests the value of peace, civility, and freedom. I mean, that's really well said. I mean, we get here into real subjectivity. And I think Pollack maybe also makes the point about the difference between the two big abstract concert works that Copland wrote in the early 1940s. In the midst of these much more programmatic, openly American works like Rodeo and Lincoln Portrait and Appalachian Spring, the Piano Sonata is one of the landmarks of the 20th century literature. It's a much darker piece, and maybe, if you will, shows the the grittier side of war. And yes, I guess I kind of agree about the Violin Sonata really having a kind of underlying optimism, if you will, the kind of open, sunny spirit, which maybe wants to suggest that things will be all right in the end. And that's always a good thing to be reminded about. Let's see what
there are some other questions from England, I can see.
Please, they're flooding in here, and I can't keep up with them. So take it away.
And I'm also in England right now, in London. And Tim and Amanda Garland. By the way, Tim Garland played with Chick Corea.
So that's Tim, why he asked.
No, but someone else actually mentioned the Chick Corea. But Tim has a really interesting observation, and I actually haven't thought about it, that there is pretty relentless counterpoint here. And I wonder if you need, I wonder if you need particular stamina on the piece as like the piano. Copland wants you playing constantly. It's true that actually the violin part, it's just like all the way through. You know, when you play a piece, you don't think about it, you just do it, right? But it is very interesting that that he does, unlike in other pieces, there you always have like a few bars rest, and the piano can do their show off. But yes, there is a space to be like a diva here in terms of the violin part. And Amanda is saying which violin did I use and how it adapted for Copland music. So just because of the cantilena and the singing properties, and violin is like a soprano in the string family. I was playing at that time for a short period on a Stradivarius violin, a beautiful instrument that has very bright color, actually. So it suited very well for this piece because there is a lot of higher register used in the violin part, middle and high register. So it gave an additional, I think, shine to the piece in terms of the violin part. Thank you for asking that. And someone said that Hilary Hahn has included the Copland Sonata in her concerts in recent seasons. Very well.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. The piece, it does get around. It's in general, Copland's chamber music as a basket of works tends to be less well known than and less often played than the bigger, more American sounding works. The thing with Copland, is with so many composers who have written a number of pieces that are really popular and really often played, is that it tends to throw other things in the shade. That maybe is especially the case with Copland, because there are so many pieces of his that are beyond popular. They're deeply embedded in America's cultural and social consciousness that we tend to have, even at this late date, a kind of narrow view of Copland's accomplishment, which is really broad. I mean, he wrote in many different media, many different genres, lots of chamber music, instrumental music, even a couple of operas, music for kids, and those tend to be pushed a little bit off the radar. I think we have time, unfortunately, for just one more quick question, and I'll try to make quick do with it. Two questions referenced Our Town, his film score for the Thornton Wilder based film. And somebody asked about the Piano Sonata, whether there are similarities in certain sections of the Violin Sonata with those two pieces. And I just refer back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, that Copland's music across the board shares a lot of basic fingerprints, if you will, that kind of transparency and spareness, the economy of means and expressivity, the sort of reserve, and regardless of the idiom, that's there, even if buried at times. Anyway, I see the clock ticking away, and we could have gone on for, at least another half hour. Thank you again for joining us. A couple of things very quickly. Our next programs in our Underscored series are on October 26th and November 9th. Both of those are Mondays at 1 p.m. Please join us. The Copland Piano Quartet is up next, October 26th, and then John Musto's new cello sonata. John Musto from the Graduate Center faculty, an extraordinary composer, written for us, a world premiere. We have a survey that will be sent to you, which will help us in programming for the future. So please look for it. Thank you for joining us. More information about Copland House at coplandhouse.org. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining.